Now let's get into the notion of how income and assets are analyzed on different time cycles. So for the high school class of 2023, that's if your child is currently a senior, colleges are going to calculate EFC based on your income for the full tax year of 2021, as well as present day asset valuations, i.e. the value of your assets at the time that you are applying for financial aid. So let's get back into the FAFSA versus the CSS profile. As a general rule of thumb, the EFC calculation is usually going to be more generous for families on the FAFSA than it is on the CSS profile. And the reason for this is because the FAFSA doesn't take into account any equity you have in your primary residence or the value of small family businesses or farms, whereas the CSS profile does take into account those valuations. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the CSS profile does take in more contextual data about special circumstances, particularly health situations or job loss. But one of the annoying things, I guess, about the financial aid process is that the schools that are the most generous with their financial aid, which means that they take into account they meet 100% of demonstrated need, they also use the CSS profile. So they meet more of the demonstrated need, but the demonstrated need calculation is actually less generous. So it's a catch-22 in that way. Now, let's talk about the situation for divorced parents, because that's really the other major difference between the FAFSA and the CSS profile, and one of the reasons why the CSS profile is just much less generous. Okay, so before we get into the differences, you have to know the term custodial parent. This is, in the context of financial aid applications, the parent who the student lived with the most in the past 12 months. So if the student lived with one parent for 6 months and 1 day, and one parent for 5 months and 30 days, the parent who the student lived with for 6 months is the custodial parent. Now, the FAFSA and the CSS profile differ in their treatment of finances. So the FAFSA is only going to consider the financial situation of the custodial parent. So it's only the custodial parent's finances which affect the FAFSA calculation, whereas the CSS profile considers both unless you can get one of those waivers, which is pretty rare. Now, really interestingly, if you as the custodial parent get remarried, the income and the assets of your new spouse are considered in that calculation, even if you have a prenuptial agreement. So even if you have a prenup that says, hey, step-parent is not going to be paying for any of my sort of child from a previous marriage or a previous relationship's college costs, the FAFSA and the CSS profile, they don't care. They're going to completely ignore that prenuptial agreement. It's pretty much the only legal body in the entire United States that can ignore a prenuptial agreement. Okay? So the FAFSA is going to consider the income of the step-parent and the assets of the step-parent. The same with the CSS profile for the step-parent that's married to a custodial parent. The CSS profile on top of that is going to consider the income and assets of a non-custodial step-parent. Once again, regardless of whether you've got that prenup in place or not. So, as a general rule of thumb, the CSS profile is going to be much less generous when it comes to the finances of divorced families. So how does aid work after your freshman year of college? So most families don't know this, but you're actually going to have to reapply for financial aid every year. And that aid can increase or decrease based on the formula that we talked about. So there's things you can do that will increase your financial aid. There's things you can do that will decrease your financial aid. But if your family's financial situation is constant, colleges are usually not in the habit of substantially changing your financial aid award. So if your EFC changes, they're going to adjust your aid award. But if your EFC doesn't really change that much, they're not going to adjust your financial aid award much either. They usually do a pretty good job of not baiting and switching you in that format. Now let's talk about communicating changes, because that's actually something that's really important. Let's say you had certain income in 2021, but because of whatever your financial situation is now, your family's financial situation looks very different. If your family's financial situation changes, you have to make sure that you communicate these changes to the financial aid office. So if this is the kind of change that impacts your financial aid application before you submit, I think 9656 had the situation, right, where they took some money out of their IRA to pay for a wedding, and as a result, they had much higher income on paper in 2021 than they will in future years. In that kind of situation, you're going to want to write that information directly into the FAFSA or the CSS profile. After you've submitted a financial aid application to the college, then you're going to have to write a letter to the financial aid office. In that letter, you want to be as specific as possible, and you want to provide supporting documentation for the claims that you're making. Now, beyond that, some colleges also offer an appeals process where if you feel like your financial aid application was not judged correctly, you can appeal for more financial aid. You can also negotiate aid packages if you have multiple aid offers. So the way this works is, let's say you apply to 10 different colleges. Some colleges give you X in financial aid money. Some colleges give you Y, and Y is more than X. You can use the colleges that give you more to negotiate for a higher aid package from other colleges. There's some guidelines for that, and we're definitely going to do a full stream into how you negotiate your financial aid package, and something that's going to happen in the spring after you apply to all your colleges. But if you are worried about financial aid, I definitely recommend negotiating your aid package for financial aid or for scholarships.